So, uh, how do you even begin to take 4,000 years of human history? I mean, complete with all its soaring triumphs, devastating tragedies, profound traditions, global migrations, and just compress all of that into a single cohesive story.
Right. It's a massive undertaking.
It really is. We are looking at a vast expanse of time today for you, and we're trying to distill the absolute essence of a people down to a narrative that's, accessible enough to grasp quickly, but still profound enough to capture the true weight of their journey. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are thrilled you could join us for this one.
It's basically the ultimate challenge for any historian or sociologist. When you look at the sweeping timeline of any ancient civilization, the immediate trap is getting bogged down in the minutia.
Oh, definitely.
You have this endless list of dates, complex geopolitical shifts, countless historical figures, the constant redrawing of borders. But sometimes, to truly understand the core DNA of a culture, you have to aggressively strip all that academic clutter away.
Just boil it right down.
Exactly. You have to look at the absolute foundational building blocks that remain when everything else is boiled off.
Which brings us to the unique nature of our source material for this deep dive. We're examining an excerpted text today, and it's titled The Eternal Thread, A Simple History of the Jewish People.
Yeah, and what makes this specific document so fascinating to unpack isn't that it's some dense, thousands of pages long academic tome.
Right, it's the exact opposite of that.
Completely. This text was originally designed to explain the entire breadth of Jewish history to a 5-year-old.
A 5-year-old.
Yeah, it intentionally keeps the concepts clear, gentle, story-driven. It highlights only the absolute largest milestones from their ancient beginnings in the Middle East, right up until the modern era.
And there's this brilliant hidden sophistication in that kind of extreme distillation, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. We often mistake simplicity for a lack of depth. But when you're forced to compress 4 millennia of continuous, often chaotic cultural existence into just a handful of core concepts for a young mind,
You're making incredibly ruthless choices.
illuminating choices about what actually matters. You discard the peripheral data and keep only the mechanisms of cultural survival, human resilience, and identity.
So, by examining the specific waypoints this simple history chooses to highlight, we uncover a masterclass in how a civilization endures, which is our mission today. We want to trace this eternal thread alongside you, examining those major turning points that forged the Jewish identity.
We want to look at the broad, sweeping human story presented here and analyze the profound psychological and sociological weight behind these seemingly simple milestones.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the very beginning, roughly 4,000 years ago in the Middle East, with a single individual named Abraham.
Right.
And the defining characteristic highlighted about him is his belief in one God. This is during an era when the surrounding populations universally believed in many gods.
We really need to pause here and truly dissect the sheer cognitive load of that paradigm shift. Because from our modern vantage point, where monotheistic religions dominate the global landscape, the concept of one God feels entirely standard to you and me.
Sure, it's just the default for a lot of the world now.
But placed in the context of the ancient Middle East 4,000 years ago, Abraham's position isn't just a slight variation in theology. It's a massive, radical rebellion against the entire established order of human reality.
I wonder, though, if we sometimes underestimate how functional polytheism was for those ancient societies. I mean, think about it. If you're living in an agrarian society and your entire survival depends on unpredictable weather, it makes perfect logical sense to assign a specific deity to the rain, another to the sun, another to the river.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of control.
Exactly. You can negotiate with the rain god if there's a drought. You perform a specific ritual, offer a specific sacrifice, and it's a transactional arrangement. So Abraham stepping away from that seems almost terrifying. He's abandoning the accepted mechanisms of controlling his environment.
That is a crucial insight. Polytheism was deeply functional, but it also painted the universe as a chaotic, fragmented battleground. If the river flooded and wiped out your crops, the ancient mindset might interpret that as the river god being angry.
Or maybe the river god is fighting the wind god.
Right, and humans are just collateral damage in this cosmic family feud. The gods of antiquity were often capricious, petty, and entirely unbound by human concepts of morality. They just wanted to be appeased.
So if you shift to the idea of a single god, you aren't just changing the number of deities you worship, you are fundamentally restructuring your understanding of the universe.
Precisely. You are proposing that the universe is not a chaotic arena of competing forces, but a unified system with a single overarching order. And more importantly, it completely changes the nature of the relationship between humanity and the divine.
Because if there's only one source of reality, that source isn't just looking for transactional appeasement.
It establishes a universal standard.
Which brings us to the next massive conceptual leap in our source material. The history introduces a special promise, often referred to as a covenant, made between God and Abraham. And the text breaks this down into two distinct elements for its young audience. First, that Abraham's family would become a great people, and second, that they would try to live in a good and fair way.
What's fascinating here is how the theology and the morality are fused together from the very first moment. It's the defining feature of the entire historical arc we are going to trace.
Let's look closely at those two elements. The first is about lineage, becoming a great people.
Right, which implies that this radical new worldview isn't meant to be the private philosophical revelation of a single mystic living in a cave somewhere. It is inherently meant to be social.
It requires a future. It requires children, community, generational transmission.
But it's the second part that gives that community its operating system, living in a good and fair way. If you adopt this belief in a singular unified divine order, the immediate consequence isn't just that you build a different kind of altar than your neighbors.
The consequence is an ethical mandate.
Exactly. Your relationship with the divine is directly mediated by how you treat your fellow human beings. And that intertwining of family lineage with a universal moral code creates an incredibly potent sociological framework.
Because in the ancient world, you were generally bound to your community by geography, right? Or by the shared threat of a neighboring tribe.
Yeah, but here we see the blueprint for a community bound by a shared commitment to a specific ethical reality.
And the history then shows how this framework begins to scale. It traces the lineage from Abraham to his grandson Jacob, and a vital detail is introduced here. Jacob is also called Israel. Jacob has 12 sons, and their families expand to become the 12 tribes of Israel.
So we're watching a localized single-family concept begin to balloon into a sprawling societal structure.
But what stands out is that they retain that familial identifier. They are a multitude of tribes, but they operate under the banner of a single ancestor.
Israel isn't just a name. It is a unifying identity marker. They are the children of Israel, carrying the lineage, the radical monotheism, and that ethical covenant forward as they grow from a family into a proto-nation.
Just imagine for a second being the listener to this deep dive, putting yourself in those shoes. Imagine being the first to adopt a completely new worldview, totally isolated from the prevailing beliefs of everyone around you. It takes an incredible amount of conviction.
It really does. But the narrative of this growing family hits a horrific roadblock, which takes us into the crucible of Egypt.
Yeah, the source outlines a brutal transition from a growing network of tribes to a deeply subjugated population. Many years later, these Israelites are living in Egypt, and a ruler, the pharaoh, forces them into slavery, making them work as slaves.
I want to dig into the cognitive friction of this era. You have a people whose foundational identity is built on a special divine promise of becoming a great nation under a unified moral God.
And yet, their daily, multi-generational reality is back-breaking labor.
Under an oppressor who likely viewed himself as a living God within a massive pantheon. The psychological violence of slavery cannot be overstated, especially in this context.
Because slavery is the ultimate apparatus for identity erasure.
Exactly. It strips away your agency, your autonomy, your humanity. You are no longer living according to your internal moral compass or your ancestral covenant. You are reduced to a unit of production for an empire that explicitly rejects your worldview.
The pharaoh represents the absolute antithesis of the good and fair way promised to Abraham. He is the embodiment of arbitrary, oppressive power.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the archetypal rescue mission.
Right. The history introduces Moses, the leader who facilitates their escape. And this escape is given a specific, weighty title in the text: the Exodus. It isn't just framed as a successful slave revolt or a strategic retreat.
No, it is framed as a foundational rupture from oppression. The Exodus serves as the ultimate narrative of liberation. It is echoed through the centuries, inspiring countless other marginalized groups throughout human history.
It establishes this profound historical memory that the natural state of this people is freedom, and that oppression, no matter how deeply entrenched the empire is an aberration that can be overcome.
But what strikes me as the most crucial part of this entire sequence isn't just the physical escape itself, but what immediately follows it.
Yes. After leaving Egypt, the history points out that Moses receives the Ten Commandments. They break the chains, walk out into the desert, and almost instantly, they are handed a comprehensive legal and moral structure.
It seems counterintuitive on the surface.
Yeah.
You just escaped a rigid, oppressive system of rules. Wouldn't the natural human reaction be to reject all authority and embrace total, uninhibited freedom?
You would think so. But that is the eternal dilemma of liberation. Freedom from an oppressor is the necessary first step, but freedom entirely devoid of structure rapidly devolves into anarchy.
And inevitably, new forms of tyranny. A traumatized, newly liberated population needs a framework to govern themselves. Otherwise, they will simply replicate the oppressive power dynamics they just escaped.
So the Ten Commandments act as the constitution for this newly formed free society. And looking at how our source text chooses to summarize those commandments for a young audience reveals so much about the priorities of that constitution.
It doesn't list all 10.
No, it highlights 4 specific rules. Be honest, be kind, respect others, and respect God. 3 of those 4 are strictly focused on human-to-human interaction.
That ratio is not accidental. It is profoundly revealing. It circles back perfectly to that original covenant with Abraham. They have just survived an Egyptian society defined by cruelty, the exploitation of the vulnerable, and a total disregard for human dignity.
Therefore, the foundational bedrock of their new society must be the exact inverse.
It must be aggressively rooted in honesty, kindness, and mutual respect. It transforms freedom from a state of mere survival into a state of moral responsibility. You are no longer slaves to a pharaoh, but you are now bound to each other through an ethical obligation.
And that 4th highlighted rule, respect God, anchors the entire system. It reminds them that this ethical obligation isn't just a good idea for social harmony. It is the fundamental order of the universe they subscribe to.
When you fuse the family lineage of Abraham, the shared trauma of Egyptian slavery, the collective euphoria of the Exodus, and this newly codified ethical structure, you witness the birth of a formalized identity.
The source concludes this section by stating that these teachings became the important part of the religion called Judaism. It is no longer just a familial belief system. It's a comprehensive, legislated way of life forged in the fires of liberation.
So they have their freedom, their law, and their shared history. But they are still wandering.
Which brings us to the next major phase, the transition from a nomadic existence to a settled civilization. The text notes that after many years of traveling, they settled in the land of Israel, built cities and farms, and eventually established kings.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. Up until this point, their entire identity, the covenant, the escape, the law, has been entirely portable. It lived in their minds, their stories, their communal actions. Doesn't settling down, beating walls, and establishing a monarchy fundamentally alter that original egalitarian nomadic spirit?
That is a deeply perceptive pushback, and it highlights a central tension in their history. Moving from a portable, conceptual society to a tangible, physical civilization introduces immense complications.
Because when you are wandering in the desert, your identity is internal.
Right.
But when you settle a specific geography, you suddenly have borders to defend.
You have agriculture to manage, trade routes to negotiate, an economy to build. The complexity of survival multiplies exponentially. The shift toward having kings wasn't necessarily a betrayal of their ideals, but a pragmatic, perhaps inevitable adaptation to the geopolitical realities of the ancient Middle East.
They needed centralized coordination to protect the society they were building.
And the history highlights a progression of 3 specific kings that perfectly illustrates how a nation-state is constructed layer by layer. It starts with King Saul. The text simply notes him as the first king.
Saul represents the painful, chaotic transition from a loose confederacy of tribes into a unified monarchy. He is the proof of concept for centralized leadership.
The 12 tribes, which had operated with a lot of autonomy, realized that a fragmented defense was insufficient against the established powers around them.
Exactly. Saul is the difficult first step toward statehood. Then we move to King David, and the specific achievement highlighted is that he made Jerusalem the capital.
This feels like a massive shift in how they view themselves.
If Saul established the concept of leadership, David established the geography of their identity. By declaring Jerusalem the capital, he creates a physical, gravitational center for the entire nation.
A capital city isn't just where the king lives. It becomes the administrative, cultural, and symbolic heart of the people. It anchors this previously wandering population to a very specific set of coordinates on the map.
Which perfectly paves the way for the third king, Solomon. His defining act in our source is building the first temple, described as a special place to worship.
The history even isolates this with a standalone sentence. The temple was very important for Jewish life. Why does this simple history place such massive emphasis on a single building?
Because the first temple represents the ultimate concretization of their entire worldview. Remember the foundational idea of one God. For centuries, the worship of that God was decentralized, taking place in temporary, portable structures or on local hilltops.
Solomon's temple created a permanent monumental architectural anchor for their faith.
It became the cosmic center of their universe. It makes the invisible, universal God feel localized and tangible.
You can see the smoke rising from it. You can make a pilgrimage to it. It is physical proof that they have arrived.
Yes, it was the absolute peak of their physical security and cultural confidence. They were no longer escaped slaves or desert wanderers. They were an established, sophisticated civilization with a capital city, a king, and a magnificent center of worship.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and where the architecture of human history becomes incredibly cruel. Establishing a physical center of gravity, building magnificent stone structures, claiming highly strategic geography in the Middle East, it does something very dangerous.
It makes you highly visible.
And in the ancient world, visibility and prosperity attract empires. Which brings us to a devastating section of our history: empires and the Great Dispersion.
This is the fatal flaw of relying on a physical center for your cultural identity. When your entire national, psychological, and spiritual existence is tied to the stones of a specific city and a specific temple, what happens when a vastly superior military force decides to tear those stones down?
It triggers an existential crisis that most ancient cultures never survived. The history lays out a brutal chronology of this vulnerability. It notes that powerful empires attacked Israel, starting with the Babylonians around 586 BCE.
They conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the first temple, and forced many Jews into exile in Babylon.
We really have to try and conceptualize the sheer psychological catastrophe of 586 BCE. This isn't just a military defeat, it is the shattering of their cosmic order. The physical embodiment of their covenant with God has been burned to the ground.
They are violently uprooted from the land they built and marched into exile. It's a horrifying return to the trauma of displacement they hadn't experienced since Egypt.
In the standard playbook of ancient history, 586 BCE is the chapter where the Jewish people should have disappeared. When an ancient culture had its capital sacked, its temple destroyed, and its elite class deported to the heart of a conquering empire, that culture assimilated.
They adopted the gods of the victor, intermarried, and within a few generations, they simply dissolved into the background radiation of history.
But the text notes an astonishing historical anomaly. It says, later they were allowed to return and built the Second Temple.
They didn't dissolve.
They somehow maintained their cohesive identity while living as captives in Babylon. The software of their culture, the laws, the stories, the belief in one God was strong enough to survive the destruction of their hardware, the temple.
When the geopolitical situation shifted, they actually went back to the ruins and rebuilt. It is a profound testament to how deeply internalized those original portable teachings had become. The ethical framework and the shared historical memory proved more durable than the stone walls of Jerusalem.
However, the tragedy of geography repeats itself. The history jumps forward hundreds of years to another catastrophic confrontation with an empire. It says, but hundreds of years later, the Roman Empire destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE.
The year 70 CE is one of the most consequential pivot points in Western civilization. The Roman Empire, the absolute superpower of the era, brought its full, mechanized military weight down upon the Jewish rebellion.
The destruction was absolute.
The Second Temple was leveled, and the physical center of gravity was obliterated once again. But unlike the Babylonian exile, which was relatively brief and ended in a return, the Roman destruction initiated a permanent structural change in the Jewish existence.
The history explains this shift clearly. After that, many Jewish people spread out and moved to many different places around the world. And it gives us the specific vocabulary for this forced scattering: the Jewish diaspora.
This is the moment that fascinates me the most. We just established that losing your physical center is usually a death sentence for an ancient culture, and yet the Roman destruction and the resulting diaspora didn't extinguish the Jewish people.
It forced an evolutionary leap, because how do you maintain a unified, distinct culture for the next 2,000 years without a country, without a king, without a capital, and without a centralized temple?
You have to completely reimagine the mechanics of survival. You have to transition entirely from a geography-based identity to an information and time-based identity.
The source outlines 2,000 years of resilience, noting that they lived across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. That is a staggering geographic footprint, placing them under the rule of countless different empires, speaking dozens of different languages, navigating wildly different climates.
And the mechanism that prevented them from simply melting into these host cultures is detailed in three distinct pillars of tradition. The first is the text, reading the Torah, their holy book.
If we use a modern analogy, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was like a massive server farm burning down.
Exactly.
If all your data was only stored on those local servers, your company is finished. But what the Jewish people had intuitively done over the centuries was upload their core operating system to the cloud.
The Torah became the ultimate decentralized data storage. You can't pack a stone temple into a wagon when the Romans force you to flee, but you can pack a scroll.
The text became the portable homeland. It provided a shared, unalterable reality, whether a community was reading it in a snowy village in Eastern Europe or a bustling port city in North Africa.
That perfectly frames the second pillar. Celebrating holidays like Passover, Hanukkah, and Yom Kippur. If the Torah is the shared data, the holidays are the protocol that forces the entire decentralized network to sync up simultaneously.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. When you are exiled from your physical space, you are forced to colonize time instead. You build architecture out of the calendar.
Passover forces the community to collectively remember the exodus from Egypt. Hanukkah recalls the resilience of the temple era. Yom Kippur is a collective day of deep moral accounting.
Because these are strictly scheduled, cyclical events, a Jew in Spain and a Jew in Persia were experiencing the exact same historical memories, performing the exact same rituals on the exact same days of the year. Time itself became their indestructible sanctuary.
And the third pillar brings it down to the local level, gathering in places called synagogues. You have the text as the shared brain, the calendar of holidays as the shared heartbeat, and the synagogue acts as the local network node.
The synagogue represents the ultimate decentralization of worship and community. Instead of requiring a pilgrimage to a single grand temple in Jerusalem, you establish thousands of microcenters wherever a community finds itself.
It is where the text is engaged with and the holidays are communalized. It is the physical anchor for people who no longer possess a physical country.
This portable identity allowed them to survive. But the history is unflinchingly clear about the intense duality of this global existence. It states plainly, sometimes they lived peacefully with neighbors, but other times they were treated unfairly or forced to move. We have to look at this pendulum swing objectively.
It is essential to recognize that the diaspora experience over those 2 millennia was not a uniform block of endless suffering, nor was it a utopian global integration. It was highly volatile.
There were extended golden eras in various regions where Jewish communities flourished, integrated deeply into the local economies, and engaged in profound intellectual and cultural exchanges with the majority populations.
They served as advisors to kings, pioneers in medicine, central figures in global trade networks.
But because they strictly maintained that distinct portable identity, because they refused to fully assimilate into the religious or cultural monoliths of the host nations, they were perpetually viewed as the other.
And when an empire faced an economic crisis, a plague, or political instability, the pendulum would violently swing toward the darker reality the text describes: unfair treatment and forced relocation. They became the ultimate, easily identifiable scapegoat.
This constant, looming threat of the pendulum swing created an evolutionary pressure for extreme adaptability. Adaptability wasn't just a useful cultural trait, it was an absolute prerequisite for survival.
You had to be mentally and logistically prepared to abandon your homes, pack up the scrolls, rely on your internal calendar, and rebuild the synagogue network in a completely unfamiliar land at a moment's notice.
And this cycle of flourishing, followed by sudden persecution and forced migration, defined the rhythm of the diaspora for centuries. But as our source outlines in its next incredibly heavy section, this historical pattern of discrimination eventually mutated into something entirely unprecedented and catastrophic in Europe.
We must approach this section with absolute solemnity, strictly observing the facts as they are laid out in the historical summary. The text traces the discrimination that had existed in parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, noting how it continued and eventually reached an industrialized, horrifying peak in the 20th century.
The parameters are extremely specific here. The text points to the years of World War II, 1939 to 1945. It identifies the geography as Germany, and it identifies the perpetrators as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis.
The history describes their objective with devastating simplicity. They tried to destroy the Jewish people. This fundamentally separates this event from the previous centuries of diaspora hardship.
This was not about economic scapegoating or religious oppression or forcing a population to relocate across a border.
No, this was a systematic state-sponsored attempt at absolute biological eradication. It is the event defined by history as the Holocaust.
The toll of this atrocity is stated plainly in the text. About 6 million Jews were killed. It is a number that almost defies human comprehension. When you try to visualize 6 million individual lives, families, lineages, and entire generational futures intentionally and systematically extinguished, it is paralyzing.
The text concludes this section by stating, "It was one of the darkest times in human history." If we connect this to the bigger picture from a purely sociological standpoint, looking at the long arc of the history we are tracing, the Holocaust represents a catastrophic rupture in their survival mechanism.
But for 2,000 years, their portable identity, their adaptability, and their ability to keep a low profile or migrate to a new host nation had kept the culture alive despite constant persecution.
But the Holocaust demonstrated that these mechanisms were entirely useless against a modern, mechanized, industrialized state machinery dedicated to total annihilation. You cannot outmigrate a continent-wide genocide.
Which makes the subsequent shift in global consciousness entirely logical. The trauma of that darkest chapter forced a massive, urgent geopolitical reckoning. The history moves from this devastation into the next section, a new country, Israel. It explains the shift simply. After World War II, many people believed the Jewish people needed a safe homeland.
This is the realization that the software of the diaspora could no longer protect the hardware of the human beings. The reliance on the fluctuating goodwill of host nations was no longer a viable strategy for long-term survival.
The consensus crystallized that physical security, self-determination, and a sovereign firewall were absolute, non-negotiable necessities.
The pivotal date is provided in the text. In 1948, the modern country of Israel was created, and it notes that many Jewish people moved there from different countries. We are witnessing an incredible historical loop closing.
From wandering tribes to a settled kingdom with temples to 2 millennia of global scattering, and now a return to establish a modern nation-state in the ancestral geography. It is a restoration of the physical center.
But what makes the modern era so unique, as the text carefully notes, is that the creation of Israel did not end the diaspora. The text states, "Today Israel is an important center of Jewish culture and life." The phrasing, "an important center," implies that it is not the only center.
And that leads perfectly into the demographic snapshot provided in the final major section. It states there are about 15 million Jewish people in the world today. But look at where they live. Israel, the United States, Europe, South America, Canada, and Australia.
This is the dual engine of modern Jewish existence. You have the geographic sovereign anchor in the modern state of Israel, providing that critical safe homeland.
But simultaneously, you have massive, vibrant, deeply rooted communities thriving globally, continuing the legacy of the diaspora network. The scattering evolved into a permanent global footprint.
It is a highly dynamic, incredibly resilient way to exist in the 21st century. You have roots planted firmly in a specific nation state, but your branches can't be across every major continent.
And the history emphasizes that these global communities are not just quietly surviving, they are actively engaging with the world. It says they continue to celebrate traditions, teach their history, and contribute to science, art, music, and many other fields.
That is the ultimate realization of the original covenant we discussed at the very beginning. The promise wasn't just to survive in isolation, it was to interact with the world in a meaningful way. They maintain the internal architecture of their traditions and history, but their output, the scientific discoveries, the cultural contributions, is shared with the entirety of human civilization.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and survey this massive 4,000-year arc, how do we neatly summarize the mechanics of this survival? The source text actually does the heavy lifting for us in its final recap, distilling the very long story into 5 core pillars.
First, believing in one God, the radical unifying paradigm shift that separated Abraham from antiquity.
Second, keeping traditions for thousands of years. The portable texts, the synchronized calendar of holidays, the local synagogues that acted as their anchor through centuries of storms.
Third, traveling and living in many countries. The harsh reality of the diaspora, the forced migrations, the adaptability, and the eventual establishment of a global presence.
Fourth, surviving very hard times. A deeply understated phrase for enduring the unimaginable, from the erasure of slavery in ancient Egypt to the mechanized horrors of the Holocaust.
And finally, fifth, continuing their culture and community today. The ultimate triumph over the forces of history. The story is not an artifact in a museum. It is a living, breathing, ongoing reality.
It truly is an eternal thread. When you stop and consider that a simple set of ancient moral rules to be honest, be kind, respect others, and respect God alongside a shared familial promise could evolve into a cultural operating system capable of surviving the rise and fall of absolute empires, 2,000 years of exile, and the darkest, most intentional tragedies human beings can inflict on one another.
It defies all standard logic of how history is supposed to work. It forces a complete reevaluation of what makes a civilization durable. We are conditioned to think of historical permanence in terms of vast empires, impenetrable borders, massive standing armies, and monuments carved out of granite.
But this 4,000-year case study suggests the exact opposite.
It suggests that the most indestructible elements of human existence are entirely intangible. A shared memory, a codified moral framework, a relentless commitment to teaching the next generation the story of who they are. You can burn a stone temple to the ground, but you cannot burn a story that a people have committed to memory.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to carry with you today. If a 4,000-year history can be sustained and kept vibrant almost entirely through a shared narrative, a set of behavioral protocols, and a portable identity that colonizes time and text rather than just geography, what does that teach us about the true durability of our own modern cultures?
In an era where we rely so heavily on physical borders, massive government institutions, and fragile digital infrastructure to tell us who we are, is it possible that the true, ancient secret to cultural immortality is simply the stories we choose to internalize, and the deliberate care with which we pass those stories down to the 5-year-olds of the next generation?
It is a profound question. It reminds us that while the physical structures of our world are always vulnerable to the shifting tides of history, the architecture of the human spirit, when bound by shared meaning and moral purpose, is incredibly difficult to break. It certainly is. Thank you so much for joining us on this expansive journey through time today.
It's always a privilege to explore these massive concepts with you and to look at the foundational blocks of human history from new angles.
We hope you found a deeper appreciation for the resilience of the human story. Until next time, keep asking the big questions, keep exploring, and we will catch you on the next deep dive. Take care, everyone.